Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third of our online London lectures for the spring term. My name is Professor Frances Bowen, and I'm Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Social Sciences at UEA. Tonight's speaker is Larissa Samuelson, a professor in UEA's School of Psychology and researcher in developmental science and cognition, action and perception. Before we hear from Professor Samuelson on her research, I'd like to give you a brief update on recent happenings at UEA. First, the invisibility of fathers who lose access to their children because of concerns about child safety has been placed under the new spotlight in new evidence presented by research teams from UEA and Lancaster University, including Professor Marion Brandon and Dr. Georgia Phillip from UEA's School of Social Work. Up against it, understanding fathers' repeat appearances in local authority care proceedings looks at fathers' involvement in care and recurrent care proceedings in England. Although there's much to be learned from existing services for mothers, the team argue that service adaptations are sorely needed to engage fathers and focus on emotional regulation, resolution of loss, and support for fatherhood as a mechanism for change and accountability. Last month, some of the most prominent and respected academics from across UEA were brought together to reveal a toolkit for the future. The toolkit, which brings together short films, audio clips, social media posts, and longer articles, looks at the past year as a unique period in our society and our culture. Topics are wide and varied, from education to fake news, from politics to the wildlife trade. History has shown that pandemics can lead to positive change, and the COVID crisis should be no different. The 10 researchers involved have focused on well-being in the classroom, finding solutions to suit both people and nature, with social responsibility as a core ambition. Some of the most hopeful lessons can come from young people, said Dr. Esther Priyadarshini, Senior Lecturer at UEA's School of Education and Lifelong Learning. She said, as they marched out of their classrooms each Friday, they created a giant classroom in which everyone could learn afresh. UEA is preparing for the return of students for face-to-face teaching, which is planned for the 17th of May. Vice-Chancellor David Richardson originally wrote to all students to ensure they knew they would be welcome back if they wished to make an earlier return. Students will be encouraged to take advantage of regular testing for COVID-19 by using the on-campus lateral flow testing centre and self-testing kits. UEA's library is open, with indoor and outdoor individual study spaces available, as well as a range of student support services for wellbeing, finance and study guidance. My script doesn't say it, but there's also a lovely outdoor beer garden emerged on campus. It's very lively in the afternoon and evening at the moment. Returning students will be able to enjoy this year's Norfolk and Norwich Festival, which will offer online and in-person cultural events from 17th to the 30th of May, with poetry, plays, concerts and new artworks in venues all over the city and on locations around Norfolk, including new sculpture in the Sainsbury Centre Sculpture Park. The restorative nature of creative expression is well known, but how do we begin our journey to express ourselves with language? This brings us to the nature of this evening's talk, which will be given by Professor Larissa Samuelson. Larissa began academic life with a Bachelor of Science honours degree from Indiana University in 1993 and continued her academic journey there to gain a joint PhD in psychology and cognitive science in 2000. From 2000 to 2015, she was based in the psychology department at the University of Iowa. Larissa then joined our School of Psychology as a professor in 2015. In 2010, Larissa received the American Psychological Association Distinguished Scientific Award for Early Career Contribution to Psychology in the area of developmental psychology. She has had continuous funding from the National Institutes of Health since 2004 and is an affiliate of the Delta Centre. Tonight, Larissa will examine the ways in which infants and toddlers vary widely in their rate of early word learning, variation that is predictive of later language development and school success. She will discuss the difficulties children face when learning even a single concrete noun and the work being done in UEA's Developmental Dynamics Laboratory to understand individual children's unique word learning pathways, work with the goal of informing interventions for children struggling to learn words. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Professor Larissa Samuelson.
Hi everyone, thank you, Francis. I'm sorry we can't all be together in London, but I guess the virtual nature of this event means we have an international gathering, so that's exciting. I know some of my family has joined from the States. I want to thank you all for joining me to hear about some of the work we're doing at UEA to understand early language development and cognitive development. Vocabulary development starts early. A 4-month-old child can respond to her name by turning her head in the direction of the speaker. Over the next few months, the number of words she comprehends will steadily grow, with evidence of an uptick in comprehension after her first birthday. The first word productions are usually between 8 and 10 months. From that point, she will slowly keep adding to the words she can say. What is called the vocabulary explosion, a sharp uptick in the number of words children produce, is seen between 18 and 22 months of age. So that by the time the child with typical development enters school, they will have thousands of words in their vocabulary. Now, any parent or carer can tell you that vocabulary development is important. It supports communication of needs and wants, it facilitates interactions, and it's darn cute. Vocabulary development also sets the stage for learning other parts of language, such as syntax and grammar. And it's been shown to be related to the development of executive function, the set of processes that help us regulate our behaviors and follow rules. It's not surprising then that early vocabulary development is related to school success. For example, Duff, Reen, Plunkett, and Nation looked at the predictiveness of 16 to 24-month-old vocabulary for later language and literacy and found significant longitudinal relationships between pre-literacy vocabulary, knowledge, and subsequent reading. Great. So to make sure that all children have the best chance of school success, we should count the number of words in the vocabularies of toddlers and try to boost the vocabularies of children who are struggling. And we know we can do this. My colleagues and I have shown that you can increase the vocabulary of 18 to 20-month-olds via a 9-week intervention where we taught 12 common names for concrete objects in naturalistic play sessions. But there's a problem. We don't actually know which children need help because vocabulary development is hugely variable. This graph is taken from a large repository of data from parent checklists of early vocabulary development. It shows the size of productive vocabulary from 16 to 30 months of age. So we have size of vocabulary here and the age in months here. And as you can see, children's vocabularies cover the full range of possibilities. So each dot on the graph represents an individual child's vocabulary, and the lines represent standardized quartiles, which are used to indicate where an individual child or a group of children stand relative to the sample. So early on, at say 16 months, you can see there's huge variability. A lot of children are here in the early stages of vocabulary development, but there's some children way up here producing as many as 600 words by parent report. Likewise, at the other end of the graph here, at 30 months of age, there are some children still with very few words in their productive vocabulary, but many more with many more words in the vocabulary, upwards of the 600 or 650. So there's lots of variability between individual children, and what's worse is that the trajectory of vocabulary development is also variable. So most children with typical development starting in this kind of range will go on to produce many thousands of words by school entry. However, some will have late emerging language difficulties. Of the children with smaller vocabularies at 24 months of age, some of whom would be called late talkers, those at or below the 15th percentile for their age and gender, a large portion will go on to bloom. They will have more average levels of vocabulary by the time they enter school, but may have weak language skills throughout adolescence. The remaining late talkers will continue to have difficulty, and some of these children will be diagnosed with developmental language disorder, significant ongoing language difficulties with no obvious cause. So Duff et al. Also concluded that the stability of vocabulary skills from infancy is too low to be predictive of language outcomes at the individual level. So how do we know which children are limited? We should focus our limited support resources on. How do we tell the children who need help from those who are going to bloom on their own? The number of words in the vocabulary does not seem to be a good predictor. Other studies have found that factors such as socioeconomic status, family history of language problems, birth variables, and other risk factors can account for some of the variability in vocabulary, but none have been found to be strong predictive links between those variables and the later outcome. So why can't we predict which children will need additional vocabulary support? One reason is that because vocabulary itself is an outcome. It's the behavior that children produce in a complex social dance of communication. So many factors, including the amount of input they hear, their own motivation and temperament, the setting of individual communication episodes, and many other things will matter. Likewise, the factors that we can measure easily at the group level, such as socioeconomic status and family history, are a couple steps removed from the process of learning words. Socioeconomic status provides some information about the child's learning environment, the context of complex dance of communication, but it's only a rough indication of the things that probably matter, like how many words the child hears, how much shared book reading goes on, and how much noise and chaos are in the home. Likewise, a family history of language difficulties is a proxy for shared environmental factors and biological processes. So in short, all these things are not what's going on in little Katya's head as she's learning or producing words. They are not actually how children learn words. So how do children learn words? It starts with input from parents and carers and the flow of daily interactions about things in the baby's world. So at mealtime, mom might introduce a new food and a new word by saying, "Try some of the banana." But to pick the right item from the lunch plate, the child needs to do a lot of work. He needs to find the word. He needs to figure out what it's referring to, so find the referent. He needs to map that word to the object in the world. He needs to locate that object in order to reach out and pick it up to respond. And he needs to later integrate that word into his vocabulary. And all of this work is supported by multiple cognitive processes, such as visual exploration, the formation of associations, and multiple memory processes. I'll unpack a few of these for you. First, finding the word. There are a couple issues here. One is knowing which of these 5 words is the one that needs to be mapped to the object in the world. Another is even figuring out that there are 5 words here, because while we represent speech like this, in reality, it's more like this. So how do infants do it? Research shows that they use something we call statistical learning. This is a general purpose learning tool wherein regularities in input are tracked and they support learning. If we look at our speech stream, the sounds that make up the word "the" all happen together really often. But lots of words can follow "the." I could say the banana, the cat, the fork, the blue hat, etc. So the statistics tell you that if you hear "the," you're likely to hear after to make the word "the." But after that, anything could happen, and that means the break in the words is right here. In 1996, Safran and colleagues showed that children can use statistics like this of how often individual sounds follow each other in speech to find words in continuous speech streams. And as I said, this process is general. So other researchers such as Kirkham, Sembler, and Johnson have shown that it also works for visual patterns like this. In their study, infants saw objects one by one on the screen. So they would see this square, for instance, kind of looming at them on the screen. It would go away and it'd be followed by a plus that kind of loomed at them on the screen, followed by the circle, followed by another square, etc. Now this diagram shows you the statistics of which items came in the sequence. And particularly, if you saw the square, the 1.0 tells us that it was always followed by the plus. The 3.3 here tells us, however, that the plus could be followed by 3 different things: the circle, the triangle, or the square. So this means that as infants watch this sequence of looming objects come at them, they formed units. They would expect the square to always be followed by the plus. And if later they were shown the square and it was followed by something like the circle, they would be surprised and they would indicate that they've learned the sequence and the statistics of that sequence by looking more to sequences they didn't expect. Okay, so now the child has found the word, but now we need to figure out what that means. We need to find the referent. This requires visual exploration of the scene and recognition of the various objects. Rachel, you want to go ahead and play that for me? There we go. In this video, the young child is actually wearing a headband that has a small camera in it, and that allows us to get a picture of what's going on from the child's point of view, rather than from kind of a remote view of the dog. And so we can get a sense of kind of how they're exploring the world. And as you can see, this visual exploration process that's so important to finding the objects out there requires a lot of work. There are many eye movements. There's lots of coordination of the head and the eyes and other parts of the body. There's work to segment the objects or separate those objects from the background. And this has to happen in shifting light conditions. And they also have to match up the current view of things like the sippy cup or the spoon or the chips with memories of seeing those things before in potentially very different contexts. So we don't really know all the details of how children manage this, but given that most do a great job of interacting with objects in their environments and learning words, it's clear that they do find a way. So once they've visually explored the objects in the scene and recognized the ones that are familiar, they need to map the new word to the right one. Multiple processes help with this step too, including detection of novelty, the existing vocabulary knowledge, and processes for forming associations. So if an 18-month-old is shown these three objects that he probably knows the name of, and then this new novel object, so this funny one here in the middle, and someone says, pick up the zeb, the child's likely to think they mean this one, and they'll pick this object up. So why is that? Well, for one thing, this object is novel, and it's unfamiliar to the children, and they generally like novelty, so they'll grab it for that reason. But also, if he already knows that this is a duck, this is a shoe, and this is a block, then it makes sense that the new word would go to the object that doesn't have a name. Once the object is selected, associative processes will help him make a new mapping between the word and the object. Okay, and so now we're going to go on to the next step, which is kind of building a map of the scene, thinking about what objects are out there so they can make a response. Okay, so reaching out to pick up the correct object means they have to have this map of what is where. And I've already shown you that there's a lot of processes involved in visual exploration. The trick is being able to remember how all those individual bits go together. So if they look away and then look back this way, they need to know where the plate is relative to their head and their foot, so they don't put their foot in their food. And this requires, as I said, having that visual map, and it requires these spatial attention processes to know what is where and attend to things correctly. So there's a lot going on in the black box of Alex's head when he tries to figure out which of the foods on his plate is the banana he should try. And if we want to understand how children learn words, we need to understand all these processes and many others and how they all work together. And it gets worse because we're talking about development, and development means change. So all these processes change over development. I'll give you one example. At 18 months, a child shown a well-known object like a duck and a novel thing and told to find the zeb will pick up the novel object. That's the bit of information I shared with you before. But if that same child, if asked to pick up the duck, will actually still pick up the novel object because the draw to novelty is too strong and it overwhelms the weak knowledge of the word duck. At 24 months, a child will correctly pick up both the duck and the zeb when requested, but after a 5-minute delay, won't be able to remember which one was the zeb. At 30 months, a child will pick up the duck and the zeb when requested, and now they will be able to remember which of the two novel objects was the zeb. So not only is there a lot going on in Alex's head when he's trying to learn a new word like banana, but this is changing over development. This is complicated. Besides figuring out which children are going to have continued vocabulary learning problems, we need to determine which of these multiple processes to support with intervention. How can we possibly know which of these processes at which point in time is the key to word learning success? How can we develop interventions that target just the right process at just the right time? Actually, I'm not sure this is the right way to look at the problem. I think this complexity could be a good thing. Rather than thinking it's about a single process acting at particular times and one path from first words to robust vocabulary, we need to think about it like this: an upward climb, but many pathways. That is, there are many ways that the processes can come together to support word learning, and many ways they can interact and change over development. For example, one child might hear a lot of language from parents and carers, be good at statistical learning, form new mappings readily, and grow their vocabulary quickly. Another child might hear less language, but be better at sustaining their attention, leading to better retention of the words they do do here. This could cascade forward so that their ability to process new words gets faster, making it easier to encode and elaborate those mappings quickly and resulting in a larger vocabulary. So in short, there are many ways the multiple processes can come together over development. And that way means there are many pathways to robust or weak vocabulary development. Understanding these multiple learning pathways requires two things: good assessments of these processes and a good theory of how it all works. In the remaining time today, I'm going to highlight some of the work my colleagues are doing in the Developmental Dynamics Lab at UEA to assess early vocabulary development and our theory of how children learn words. Specifically, I'll show you our cross-situational word learning, early language processing, and spatial attention tasks, and our formal computational model that we call WOLBS. So earlier, I told you about statistical learning. This is a general learning process based on regularities in the input that can support learning. And I gave you the examples of using statistical learning to find words in the speech stream and to track patterns of visual objects. Another version, called cross-situational word learning, involves tracking the statistics of which words and objects happen together most often over multiple events. So imagine that I showed you these two objects and I said, bosa, khaki. And then I showed you these two objects and I said, regli, bosa. When I later show you this object, you should be able to say that it's the bosa. And if you can do that, you're as smart as a 12 to 14-month-old infant. Because research has shown that 12 to 14-month-old children can learn up to 4 new words in a cross-situational word learning study, such as this one. Now, here's how we test this in the laboratory. We're using a remote eye tracker to study this. So in the picture here on the left, you can see our objects presented on the screen, and then you can see our eye tracker here in front of the screen. It has an infrared light source here that bounces some light onto baby's eyes, the reflection of which is then picked up in the cameras. And that camera then tracks where they're looking and calculates all kinds of cool measures about looking time for us. In this picture on the right, you can see this little bullseye sticker we put on the baby's forehead. The program in the computer is trained to look for that bullseye, and that helps it keep track of where the baby's head is in space as they're moving around and wiggling and exploring the visual objects. Laura's holding up an object right here so that we can make sure we're getting a good image of the baby and the tracker knows where the baby's head is. This is actually Laura Carissimo, who helped with this research and led the research actually in the laboratory. This next video, and Rachel, you can go ahead and play that one. This actually shows from the camera's point of view the baby doing the task. You can see the bullseye sticker. You can see the small little eye movements. They're rather subtle, but that's why we've got the eye tracker to help us pick up on where the baby's looking and do all the hard counting for us. You can also see that mom's wearing a pair of blackout glasses so that she doesn't see what's going on the screen and can't help baby out. Okay. And then in this next video, there we go. We'll see this one actually, the task. The pink light at the bottom is that infrared light source. And then this is the calibration sequence that's going on with a looming object in the middle. That helps to tell the computer where the visual stimulus is going to be. This is an attention getter, and then we start our trial.
Cake, ready. Bossa, coconut. Bossa, cake.
So we have 30 trials that present 6 objects and 6 words, along with all the different pairings.
Khaki.
And after these 30 trials, we move into test.
Money, money, money.
And as you can hear there on the test trials, the same word repeats over and over again. The idea is that if the child made the mapping between the word and the object during the training, now hearing just the word should push their attention to look at the target object. So we're going to measure how much do they look at the word that occurred with the target, with that object. Sorry, how much do they look at the object that occurred with the word on our test trials. So what we have in terms of our data, looking to the time in seconds to the target and the distractor on those test trials. These are the data from Smith and Yu and Yu and Smith that I referred to earlier. For 14-month-olds, the 12-month-olds perform similarly, and basically you can see that the 14-month-olds look more to the target than to the distractor on those test trials. Okay, so I've shown you the task we use to measure statistical learning. Next, I want to tell you about our early language processing task. We've developed this task to quickly measure multiple processes that support early word learning, including accessing existing vocabulary, novelty detection, forming associations, and memories of the mappings. And this is work that's been led in the lab by Laia Fiblia, who's doing it as her thesis work. We're also using an eye tracker in this task, so we have a similar setup with a screen presenting a couple objects, and then this cute little animated character, Mandy. Mandy will say words, and so on comprehension trials, we can measure if Mandy says tiger, do the babies actually look to the correct picture on those comprehension trials. So our dependent variable will again be looking at the correct picture. And on this one, before you play, actually, what I want to highlight here is this is going to be the video from the eye tracker's point of view. You can see the two images. You can see the little pink dot that right now is sitting at the bottom of the chicken. That's actually going to be the track. So that's going to be the video of where the baby's eyes are moving during the trial. The little squares, faint orange squares that appear around the chicken and the butterfly, those are the boxes that we use to tell the computer what the regions of interest are. So the areas where we're interested in when the baby's eyes are in those squares, they don't actually appear during the test. There'll be also a circle around Mandy when she pops up. That's because this is a gaze contingent task. That means that the babies have to look at Mandy before she'll talk. And that means we can know where they're looking at the beginning of each trial. So I think we can get that playing now, Rachel. It's going to flash a bit. That's because it's from the butterfly point of view. It doesn't actually flash in the real task. If you look at the baby in the middle, you can see the bullseye sticker on his forehead.
Look at the one that's small.
And you can see his eyes bopping back and forth.
Look at the one that's crying.
Okay, now I will share again. Okay. So those are comprehension trials. We also present reinforcement or speed of processing trials. These capitalize on the gaze contingent nature of the task. So as I said, when the trial starts, when the baby actually looks at Mandy, and on these trials, she'll say the name of a really highly familiar, very common word. So something, object, something like flower or ball or baby or dog. I'm showing you 4 different versions of this. They're actually the same size when they're presented as the other kinds of trials. I just wanted to show the variability. And so since we know that they have to be looking at Mandy at the point when she says the word, we can then measure how quickly they can get their eye to the correct object. And so that gives us the speed of processing measure. We also do novelty detection and reference selection trials. So on these trials, we present a novel object and then another object that they would know the name of very well, like cat. Before Mandy says anything on these trials, we get a novelty detection measure by looking at how much they look at the novel object versus the more familiar object. And then she'll say a word, and similar to the trials I showed you before with the zeb and the novel objects, she'll say a novel word like zeb, and we're looking to see if they map that novel word to the novel object. So do they look at this particular object? And then we have reference selection trials. And on those trials, these happen after a delay. So we wait 5 minutes in between the other trials and these. And now we're going to see if they can remember those mappings. So we'll present 2 objects that they would have seen before, and she'll say the name, such as zeb, and we're looking to see if they can remember which of the 2 objects was the zeb. So that's our new assessment of multiple language processes. I'll show you one more task we're using in the lab to look at spatial attention processes. Now this task we've been using in conjunction with a neuroimaging method called NIRS, that stands for Near Infrared Spectroscopy. This uses near infrared light to measure blood flow in the brain. So in this top-down view here, so here I have the baby here, you can see she's kitted up with a number of wires. These are a set of sources and detectors. These sources are going to send near-infrared light into the baby's head. It turns out that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, hemoglobin, reflect light differently. So the detectors that are also in this bundle, there's going to be some sources and detectors, are going to measure how much light is bouncing back out of the baby's brain. And that's going to tell us which part of the brains are active when participants are doing a task. Let's see, I'll start the video playing for this one. Oops. Or maybe I won't. There we go. Okay, now here you can see the full calibration sequence. It's going to show all the different parts of the screen we direct the eye tracker to. And then we'll start the trials. There'll be a central cue, and then an object will pop up on either the right or the left. And if you watch really carefully, you can see that there's a small dot that's going to appear on some trials before the target, so that second object, either on the right or the left. So there's a target, the rabbit, and on some trials before that appears, a dot will pop up. Sometimes the dot's going to pop up on the same side as the target. Other times it's going to pop up on the other side, okay? And so by looking at how quickly the infant gets her attention to the target, when there's an extra dot that could have grabbed her attention either on the same side, which would help, or on the opposite side, which would conflict and draw her attention away, we can get a measure of her spatial attention abilities. And then with the NIRS measurements, we also learn what areas of the brain support this. Now here is a gratuitous cute baby video doing our task. As you can see, we're using the eye tracker again, so there's that bullseye. But I did also want to show you the kind of net that we use to hold the sources and detectors on baby's head. You can see that they clip into these little spots here. But what that means is the baby can be freely moving and exploring, moving her head around as she's exploring the stimuli and participating in the task. And that's nice because that means she doesn't have to be still. And that's means we can have a neuroimaging method that works very well with infants who are awake and behaving, as opposed to something like MRI where they'd have to be lying still in a scanner. And she can have her snack and she can just kind of enjoy. So for them, it's just like going to the movie because they've got that big screen, they're having their snack. It's like eating popcorn, but with wires and bullseyes in your head. All right, so I've shown you how we assess some of the processes that support early word learning. And now I want to show you how we put them together in a theory. This is work I've done in collaboration with Jaz Bahat and John Spencer. And really what we've been trying to do is develop a theory that takes all these processes that support visual exploration and word learning and put them together so we can understand how they might be interacting in baby's head as they're doing some of our tasks. So our theory is instantiated in a formal computational model. So that means we have a computer program that can be made to do some of the same tasks that children do, like that cross-situational word learning task that I showed you before, right? So we have the same stimuli that I was showing from Crosssit here. WOLFS itself stands for Word Object Learning via Visual Exploration in Space. It's actually made up of two prior models that we've used to understand word learning. So the Word Object Learning model and the Visual Exploration in Space model. The Visual Exploration in Space model uses processes of object recognition to form a scene representation. And this uses spatial attention, different forms of working memory, so spatial working memory, and then also novelty detection processes to explore object features in the environment and then bind them together into a unified representation. The Word Object Learning model takes word forms and uses statistical learning to form associations between words and objects. These associations are stored in the vocabulary. So we have these memories of the mapping, they'll be stored in the vocabulary, and that can then support access of the existing vocabulary to help learn new words. Now the schematic that I'm showing gives an idea of what how we put all the processes together to understand early word learning. The model itself is realized using dynamic field theory. This is a framework for understanding how the action of populations of neurons in the brain create behavior, learning, and development. The key idea is that for the model, like children, seeing objects like these stimuli from CrossFit create hot spots of activation in the brain that represent object features such as shape and color. So here are two of the actual fields from the model. These are two of the actual cortical fields. And these particular fields represent objects in terms of their shape and their color and where they're located in space. So when this picture was taken, this is like looking down at a field of neurons in the brain and watching as their activity changes over time. When this picture was taken, these fields were actually looking at this green object and representing round and green on the right side of space. To give you a feel for the model, I want to show you a movie of it doing cross-situational word learning. These two fields here are the same two fields that I was showing just a minute ago. These are some attention and working memory fields. And then these are the scene fields that make a map of what's out there in the environment. And then here is the field where words are coming into the model. So this is where it's going to get word input. And as it does that, it's going to send that information into these fields that will also get information about the features of the objects. And it will make these little dots. You can see what are the mappings between words and features of objects. So a critical feature of Wolves is that it's autonomous. We can kind of start it running and let it do the task on its own. And it can actually do the same task that children do. So we'll show it the exact same stimuli in the exact same order as we show in our cross-situational word learning task. And we'll give it the words, and it will create mappings. And we'll get this measure of looking time. So how often does it look to, or how much time does it look to the right or the left? And in the movie I'll show you, you'll see this little face that helps make clear which side it's looking to at each point in time. So I'll blow it up a little bit, and then I will start it playing. So as the Wolves attends to objects, like it's attending to this green object here on the right, you'll see those hotspots develop, and then it will send ridges of activation across into the scene and into the word feature binding fields here. If it's attending to the object at the same time a word is presented, so here's a word, it'll make a little mapping like these right here between the words and the features. Sometimes it'll be attending to the right object that goes with a particular word. Other times it'll just happen to be attending to the incorrect object for whatever reason, and then it will make a mapping between the wrong features and that particular word. But over time, over those 30 trials of the tests, of the experiment, it will get all the right statistics to make the correct mappings between the words and the objects. And that's going to lead to another behavior. And that's going to lead to what we examine and test, which is now presenting a single word and measuring whether that word is enough to drive attention to the correct object. And we'll get that same looking time measure that we get with young infants. So here's the graph I've shown you before, looking time in seconds to the target and distractor for the infant data from Smith and Yu and Smith. And now I'm adding the data from Wolves. And as you can see, Wolves shows the same behavior as the children, more looking to the target than the distractor test. We've actually used Wolves to look at developmental differences. So we've captured data from 5 cross-situational studies, word learning studies with adults, and 7 cross-situational word learning studies with infants, toddlers, and children. So we know then that Wolves is a developmental model that can capture change over development. Wolves also captures individual differences. So Yu and Smith found that some children did better in the cross-situational word learning task than others. And likewise, some runs of Wolves do better than others. So Yu and Smith classified children who learned 4 out of the 6 words they presented as strong word learners, and children who learned fewer than 4 words as weak learners. And what we're showing here then is the proportion of all the kids that participated in the study who were strong versus weak learners. We can also classify runs of the model in the same way as strong and weak. And what you can see is that Wolves also shows the same proportion of strong versus weak learners that Yu and Smith found. So that's nice in terms of capturing data. But the other thing that's nice about Wolves is we can actually look under the hood and see what causes these differences. And it turns out in Wolves Being a strong or a weak learner depends on your spatial attention. So if you have better spatial attention, you turn out to be learning the words better. We're currently testing how other processes in the model, such as working memory, memory decay, and novelty detection, create individual differences in the model's performance. Looking forward, we want to understand how these processes create multiple learning pathways in the model. So for example, having weak spatial attention and fast memory decay might be particularly problematic because it would create a weak representations of words and objects, and it might prevent the elaboration of new mappings that are formed. However, there should be ways to compensate. So if weak spatial attention is paired with strong working memory, it might mean even short bouts of attention are enough to create representations that can be robustly mapped to words. We believe that process-based models like wolves are the key to understanding how these processes interact and which combinations of abilities are beneficial and which are problematic. Further, we think that combining wolves with our assessment tools can help us to determine which children are most in need of support. And because we can capture development in wolves, it can help us to understand how these processes are changing over time. So we already know that in wolves, as good word-object mappings build, they can influence the system and how it explores the scene. So the word-object mappings that a child with good statistical processing creates can help support future visual exploration and the formation of new object representations and word-object mappings, creating this positive feedback loop that can help support vocabulary development. So this then can help us to understand when interventions might be most useful. Doing this requires that I add one more thing to my list of what's needed. We need good studies that combine longitudinal assessments of individual children's growing vocabularies and with assessments of the processes that support the vocabulary development. And we need to simultaneously capture those processes in our model to have a rigorous theoretical understanding of how this complex system unfolds. This is what we're working towards with a long-range goal of creating individual models that capture the processing of individual children and how this changes over time. The idea is that we could then test out candidate interventions on the models to see what specific supports would help each child reach their full vocabulary development potential and go on to success in school and beyond. This will then help us to understand how to help individual children. So to conclude, today I've argued that understanding how children learn words requires understanding multiple cognitive processes. These processes interact and change over development, so there are multiple ways they can come together to create robust or weak learning. I've shown you some of the ways my colleagues and I are assessing these processes, and I've also shown you our formal computational theory of how children learn words and how this changes over development. And then I've pointed to our future plans to collect longitudinal vocabulary data and use our computational model to create individual models to help each child reach their full vocabulary development potential and then go on to success in school and beyond. So I want to thank you for your attention and your patience with my technical difficulties tonight. I want to thank the wonderful team I work with in the Developmental Dynamics Laboratory at UEA, showing some of the members here. We also have a number of undergraduates who do projects in the laboratory, some of whom are presented in this picture, but we've had a number over the years, and I thank them for their help and support as well. Of course, I also have to thank the children and parents who make our research happen by dedicating their time and supporting the work we do, and also the National Institutes of Health in the United States for the funding. Thank you.
Well, terrific. Thank you very, very much, Larissa. And of course, if we were in live, sort of, you'd hear a resounding round of applause. But please accept my applause on our attendees' behalf today. Thank you very, very much. And as a grandma of a 26-month-year-old child that I haven't actually seen since his first birthday, I'm now wishing I'd been recording all the FaceTime interactions so that I could see the progression, and maybe slightly wishing I'd stuck a little bulldozer on a little bullseye on his forehead as well. But in all seriousness, thank you very much. You gave us a great exposition of the lab's work. So before we move on to our Q&A, I'd like to make a small request of you all. We'll email everyone who's registered for tonight's event with a link to the short evaluation survey. We'd be very grateful if you'd take a few minutes to complete it, which will help us plan for future events, both online and I hope very soon in person. We now have the opportunity for you to ask Larissa any questions you might have. To ask a question, use the Q&A feature, and depending on which device you're watching on, you'll either find this on the right hand side or under the small icon with a speech bubble containing a question mark. We may not be able to get to every question, but we'll do our best to pose as many as possible to Larissa before we wrap up, and I'm aiming to wrap up in about 20 minutes at about 7:40. If we do run out of time, though, don't worry, there'll be an opportunity to continue the discussion over on Facebook, and you can find out more information in the announcements. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these questions. We've had lots of good questions coming in, and I'm actually going to move them around a little bit, and I'm going to start with a question. We've had two of them on a very similar topic. It's about multilingual children. So Ian has asked, how do children with parents speaking their own native language face any additional challenges when faced with learning English and their parents' own language? And Viviana has asked, what's the best way to raise multilingual children?
Okay, well, I will first preface this by saying there's a lot of really excellent research out there looking at bilingual development and multilingual development, which we have a lot of as well. And I am not an expert on all of it, but there are lots of also wonderful resources that you could look at as well. In the context of a couple of specific things I talked about today, so reference selection and retention, those tasks where you might show a duck and then the novel object and then say a novel word. That's a particularly interesting case looking at children who are exposed to multiple languages because, of course, what counts as a novel word would be different, and you might have cases where they might know duck in one language but not in their second language. So there's some excellent research examining those processes. It does turn out that there can be some, as you might expect, some development's complicated. Adding additional languages can make it more complicated, but children are also remarkably robust, right? And so they can sort these things out. And they can actually, bilingual children will do fine on those kinds of tasks where they're asked to find a referent in the context of familiar things. It will matter if they know the name of the novel object in one language or the familiar object in one language or another, but they can sort these things out. And one of the kind of points that I wanted to also kind of highlight today was that idea there's lots of ways that these processes can come together. And that also means for a bilingual child, there's lots of processes. And there's lots of supports out there as well. So a bilingual child who may be hearing Spanish at home and English at school, for instance, has a nice context cue of very different environments where they're hearing those two languages, and they can use that information. It's kind of like another form of statistical learning. These kinds of sounds happen in this context, these kinds of sounds happen in this context, and that can help sort out. Or these sounds happens with Bubba, and these sounds happen with my parents, and those kind of things can help them sort that out. In terms of the second question, in terms of supporting that, one thing that then can be supportive is making sure there are those kind of distinct cues as well, right? So giving them those footholds in terms of separating which language is which, either by different speakers or using them consistently in context. That can get difficult, of course, if there's multiple pressures on the language environment, but consistency can help, and having input, right? So the other big one for all children is talk to them, read the books, explain things to them. They understand very, very early, and they can pick up and use that knowledge right away. So describing the objects that they're seeing when you're out at the park, when you're looking through a book, all of that can really help from very early on for all the children.
Okay, terrific, thank you very much. And you did touch on, in your talk, it was primarily about visual attention, I think, or at least, and Sylvia's asking, do you measure auditory attention as well?
Auditory attention is interesting and a bit tricky, right? So we've got, especially with babies, we have some advantages for visual attention. One, we can use the fancy equipment like the eye tracker to help kind of see where they're looking with their eyes. The other thing that's very helpful for babies is very early on that some of the problems of coordination of your eyes and head are solved by actually just keeping them together. So they don't do a lot of these fancy things where they look at it side-eyed so much, right? But they keep them together, and that means we can kind of look where you're pointing your head, and that makes it easy for us to track. Auditory attention with the auditory signal, which is much more diffuse, is more difficult. We can do things where you can set up tasks where you can have two different things playing on speakers and then use head turns to be able to tell what they're listening to as a way to kind of measure auditory attention. And again, there's some excellent work looking at how children can pull out, how early they can pull out things like their name from noise using systems and things like this, and how they can direct their attention in that way. So I don't do the specifics of that, but sometimes you can use kind of big cues of their babies moving to try to figure out what they're attending to in that way.
Yeah, and Libby's asked actually, is it possible to do these tests or supplementally somehow with Mandy, instead of it being on the screen, being an actual person testing without the software? Do you do anything like that?
Actually, the testing on the screen is actually the newer direction for me.
Okay.
So a lot of my prior work, and actually all my work that I've done where I would show a duck and a novel object and ask them to get the blicket, that would all have been done live, face-to-face before. We've moved to the eye tracker actually because one of our hopes is to be able to make these assessments that might be portable and easy to get the data from. So the eye tracker does a lot of fancy calculations for me that help me to get my data. If I do it live, I have to go back later and somebody, like a very helpful research assistant in the lab, might go back and help code exactly where the baby was looking or what they picked up or what they said. And that's more time consuming. So we've actually used the early language processing task that I was talking about in a study in India, work with my colleague John Spencer. And the idea there is to try to be able to take it into more remote environments in different kind of contexts and do large scale assessment to try to understand language development in different kind of contexts with lots of data. So yes, we can do the live ones, and there's all kinds of very interesting things you can manipulate in that context that you can't manipulate as easily on the screen. And there are some interesting differences because babies get to interact with those objects, and that can change the nature of it. So yes, you can. It's very interesting. In this particular line, we're trying to go towards large scale, which means automated is helpful.
Yeah, and in fact, that takes me to the next question. So this is from Richard. Do you know if yours and other models are being used in computational AI solutions? So what's the direction of travel there?
I think it would depend a little bit on what specifically he means by a computational AI solution. Yeah. The modeling framework that I work in, dynamic field theory, is used kind of largely in a bunch of different kinds of contexts. So colleagues in Germany actually use it to drive robots, autonomous robots. And so it can be used in solutions where you're kind of looking at reaching or human-robot interactions. Other colleagues have used it to even predict neural bold responses from fMRI. It's been used to look at reaching paradigms with animals, monkeys who are doing some reaching. So it's got a wide range of uses and applications. And kind of, as I said, what we're trying to move towards is really looking at how those models can be changing over time, which would get closer to kind of AI and development over time of the models that might be mapped on to the children.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask a technical question now. I don't even understand the question, so I'm going to ask it and see if it makes sense to you. So this is from an anonymous person. Have you tried a 4 AFC task for word learning and novel object, or just a 2 AFC task? Is there a reason for doing it just a 2 AFC? A 2 AFC task could let them get a 50% correct response.
Yeah. So 2 AFC means 2 alternative forced choice.
Okay.
So in all the videos that I was showing you, there was a target and a distractor. So 2 alternatives the babies could pick from. As I mentioned previously, a lot of the work that I did with live, what I would call across the table task for that for the duck would actually be a duck, a hat, and a novel object. So that would be a 3 alternative. When we look to see how the performance at the group, if babies are performing correctly and trying to understand the data, we do mark it against chance. So we would say if we're doing 2 alternatives, they have to do a certain proportion better than 50% to be said that they really are showing performance that's not just random guessing. If we're doing a 3 alternative, of course, then we make that against 33%, and 4 alternative 25, etc. So yeah, we do mix that up depending, and there are some interesting differences. If you have more competitors when you're doing some of those tasks, that makes it more or less difficult for the babies. So the number of choices does matter. There has been some work kind of looking at that to try to understand. So yeah.
Interesting. We've got a couple of questions around, I think I'm going to put them in the category of kind of learning in different styles. So John has asked about a book called How We Learn by Stanislas Dehaene, and he wonders if there's any links between this theory of constantly modified hypotheses and your approach. I don't know if you're familiar with that, if you've got any comment on that.
I don't know the details of that book. I mean, the idea of constantly modified hypotheses might also be thought of kind of making predictions about how things might turn out, and then modifying your behavior based on what the reality ends up being, right? In the word learning domain, something similar is looking at, for instance, the cross-situational word learning. One of the ideas is that you might be doing hypothesis testing. So on every trial, when you see 2 objects, you make a hypothesis. Okay, Blicket goes with the green one, right? And then you wait until that gets disconfirmed, where the green one comes up and Blicket isn't the word that's presented, and now you have to try a new hypothesis. The model that we've developed can show those same kind of behaviors. I think underneath is actually an associative learning engine. That's what's actually working in our model. But it can show hypothesis testing or predictive kind of behaviors as well.
Yeah, and Christina's asking if there's a difference in the development of concrete and abstract words.
Well, yes. So concrete words are generally earlier. So early vocabularies will be composed more of the concrete nouns. There are lots of reasons that something like that would make sense. They're going to be very prevalent. They're going to be easy to pick up and manipulate by babies, and they're going to hold constant shape and things like that. So easy input to receive. Abstract words are going to be harder. There will have some, right? They'll have some interesting ones very early on. I love you will be something babies can say, and really understanding what that means is a little difficult. So yeah, there's some very interesting developments, and there's very interesting questions about how those abstract words then are learned, because you don't have the same kind of very concrete input to help you learn them.
Yeah, I'm going to finish off with a couple of pandemic-related questions, because that's all in mind. So, Jean has asked, do you feel that learning styles or learning pathways will have affected how much children and young people can draw from online teaching? So I think it's an interesting question if you think about the different pathways you had there. So I don't know what responses you might have to that, and what we can learn or what we know about how children and young people can draw from online teaching.
Yeah. So in terms of the specific kinds of processes I was referring to, I think if you think about the ways that being engaged with an individual in a lecture setting, in a discussion, in something like this even, right? If you have a back and forth conversation with someone, or you're actually watching someone lecture and they're engaging with you, the way that motivates you and that directs your attention, right? It can be very different than the way it might happen online when you don't have that kind of same back and forth. And so, yes, I can imagine that to the extent that there might be motivational differences, there might be engagement differences, there may be issues with kind of communication and picking up on the subtle details. There's a lot of subtle things that happen when we're communicating with each other. Another one in these kind of team formats is, Teams formats or Zoom or something, they totally disrupt the ability to have a conversation with more than one person, or more than one conversation, right? So you can imagine in a classroom setting where there might be lots of things kind of going on at once, and children could be benefiting. One of the things my own daughter mentioned actually when she was going to online learning was that she didn't have her friends there helping her talk through what problems were. Right? So I can imagine that would also be an issue. So those are, maybe not necessarily the exact same processes I'm talking about, except that, if you repeat information, so you're talking with your table mate about something that the teacher, trying to get clarification, or you're saying, oh yeah, I remember, and you talk about an example, you're repeating that, and that might help your memory of that, and so that would spiral forward to learning. So a little bit kind of vague, but yes, I'm sure it matters.
Oh, it's interesting. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
There's also, look closer to my own stuff, there was some very interesting stuff that was just reported earlier in the week from BBC about actually language development of very young children looking like it might be delayed because they're not getting the same amount of input that they might be if they were out in the play groups and at preschool and having some of the interactions they would be having in a non-academic world.
Yeah,
so.
and exactly. I was going to use chair's privilege and ask you about that report right at the end, because I thought I'm going to ask Larissa about that. What did you think of that report? Could you give us a sense of what it said and maybe your take on that and what we might expect?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised, right? Because as I said before, the thing that is just generally beneficial is, talking to children. And there's lots that, of course, parents can be doing during the pandemic in terms of reading with their children and sharing experiences and discussing what they're seeing on the TV or whatever. But the number of different kinds of experiences that children will be having, going to the zoo, going to the beach, going to the store, doing the shopping, it's not all fun stuff, all the chores, you can learn while you're doing those things too. They may not be getting that, and so the input could be reduced. And if parents are dealing with difficult situations with homeschooling the 7-year-old while also trying to take care of a toddler, it's going to be reduced. So I'm not surprised to see that children are having more difficulty with language, and I would totally agree that I would expect referrals for speech problems and language problems to unfortunately be higher.
Down the track. Okay, well, thank you very, very much, and thank you particularly for your patience and your full answers to the questions there. And thanks also to everybody who's on the call today who actually sent in the questions. There's some really, really good ones in there, and I now understand what an AFC is, so that's good. But really, thank you all for joining us this evening. If you'd like to continue the conversation or take the opportunity to network with other attendees, please head over to the Facebook event discussion using the link that's just been posted in the announcements. And if you enjoyed tonight's lecture, there's also a link to sign up for our monthly What's On email newsletter, which will keep you up to date on future public events from UEA. So with that, thank you very, very much, Larissa. I thoroughly enjoyed the evening, and it's always fun. I've visited the lab before and enjoyed having a look and watching cute babies and seeing what we can learn. But the science behind it, the computational power behind it, and the in fact good theory, which I'm a fan of course, is absolutely great to see. So thank you very, very much, and thank you all for attending. And thanks also to UEA colleagues behind the scenes for this really, really interesting talk. There's a production crew behind you who've been doing a great job, and so thank you very much to you all. So with that, I'll close the discussion. If you'd like to go over to the Facebook event, please do that. And thank you very much, Larissa. Please do take care and have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.